Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kaya Stern, and I am the co-founder and director of the Prison Studies Project, faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the first practitioner in residence at the Radcliffe Institute. It is my honor to welcome you today to Climate Justice and Mass Incarceration, a program that bridges Radcliffe's focus areas on law, education, and justice, and climate change, with a particular focus on climate justice. I would like to acknowledge the Ethel and David Jackson Fund for the Future Climate, which is supporting this event, as well as members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your collective generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Across the US and globally, we have witnessed a series of increasing climate hazards. The effects of climate change will continue to intensify and have the greatest impact on people who are already profoundly vulnerable, including those who are—
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Right on time. Incarcerated or detained. Tragically, conversations about climate change commonly exclude these voices. Before we discuss climate hazards in jails and prisons, I offer some context. People in US jails and prisons are more likely to come from climate vulnerable regions, places where extreme environmental hazards are deliberately imposed, and locations where people lack the resources to migrate to safer areas as a preventative measure or in times of emergency. BIPOC communities, as well as people with low incomes and those from rural areas, are particularly vulnerable. People who are incarcerated are also more likely than the general population to have been exposed to pervasive toxic stress environments, to be afflicted with chronic health conditions, to be aging, and to live in overcrowded settings. Exposure to climate hazards like tainted water and harmful air pollutants are linked directly to health afflictions and premature death. Unlike other vulnerable communities, the lines of communication for incarcerated people are severed by design, and people do not have the means to evacuate freely. They are entirely reliant on the state for protection. In emergencies like fires or floods, they are all too often forgotten or left for last. The moral, fiscal, and human cost is beyond measure. To be clear, prisons are environmental hazards. Too often they are built in remote areas with decaying infrastructure or near or directly on abandoned industrial sites. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, 32% of state and federal prisons are located within 3 miles of federal Superfund sites. In the words of Loyola University professor Andrea Armstrong, incarcerated people are unwillingly standing on the front lines of climate change. So what are we to do? We are fortunate to have 4 speakers and a moderator with us today who will offer their perspectives, experience, vision, and expertise. Their conversation will underline the importance of new research, innovative practice, and steadfast commitment to justice and meaningful change, very much including the voices and knowledge of those who are currently and formerly incarcerated. Our speakers are Alleen Brown, independent investigative journalist and senior editor of Drilled; Juan Haynes, editor-in-chief of Solitary Watch and senior editor at San Quentin News; Amika Mota, executive director of Sister Warriors; Ufwoma Ovianmada, PhD student in the Aeronautics and Astronautics Department at MIT and research assistant at the MIT Media Lab. And our moderator today is Eric Henderson, co-author of Hidden Hazards: The Impact of Climate Change on Incarcerated People in California State Prisons, and founder of Eric Henderson Consulting. We will hear first from Eric, who will moderate a conversation with the speakers, and we will conclude with audience Q&A. We encourage those watching to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program, and the speakers will address as many as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you please keep them short. This will increase the number of questions we can answer. Thank you. It is now my distinct honor to pass the virtual floor to Eric Henderson.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Henderson, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss climate justice and mass incarceration. Before we begin, as you already heard, I want to note that one of our panelists, Juan Haynes, is calling from a California state prison. Due to the limitations on the time for this call, there may be periodic voiceover interruptions and slight breaks in Juan's participation. You will continue to hear those throughout the program, and we appreciate you bearing with us. So I want to start with our first question, asking each panelist to introduce themselves. Specifically, can you introduce yourself, briefly describe your background and connection to this work, and why the connection between climate justice and mass incarceration matters? Amika, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Eric. It's an honor to be on this panel today with you all, and thank you for everyone who's joining us to learn more about the issues we're discussing today. My name is Amika Mota. I'm the Executive Director of the Sister Warriors Freedom Coalition. I also have direct experience with incarceration. I was incarcerated for 7 years at both of the women's prisons here in California from 2008 to 2015. I paroled in 2015. The last 2.5 years I was incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility, which is the largest women's prison in the world. In the 2.5 years that I was there at CCWF, I was an incarcerated firefighter. So I have a unique experience with the intersection of incarceration and climate justice. We were the ones that responded not only to calls within the prisons, but also in the local areas surrounding the prison. In 2017, we founded the Sister Warriors Freedom Coalition. This coalition was founded to empower and inspire women and trans people of all genders who have been disproportionately impacted by incarceration, racist and sexist policies, juvenile and criminal justice systems, and/or the underground street economy, to create positive change in their lives and communities. We meet people where they are at, on the streets, in jails and detention centers and prisons, in the neighborhoods and communities where we and they live. We create economic and leadership opportunities through fellowship, employment, and engagement in advocacy and organizing. Together, we are building our personal and collective power to heal from trauma, advocate on behalf of ourselves and each other, and gain access to education.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And transform the conditions, systems, and policies that lead to intergenerational cycles of violence, incarceration, and poverty. We also answer to currently incarcerated people, and it is so important that we have that voice here in the room today. We're grateful to have Juan in space, and I also carry with me the voices of many of our sisters and siblings that are currently incarcerated. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I'll pass it back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Amika. Juan, we'll pass it to you. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juan Marino Haynes. Currently, I'm editor-in-chief of Solitary Watch, and one correction, I'm no longer with San Quentin News. I did manage San Quentin News for about 15 years, and began the inaugural publication of its magazine called Wall City. I'm basically a facilitator at this prison, and one of the programs that I proudly facilitate is called The Green Life. It's an ecology program here at San Quentin, and we basically work to build community and sustainable lifestyles within the incarcerated population. With the Green Life, the program was suspended during the COVID period, and we just barely got it back up to par right now. And so with the work that I do around ecology and prison, I've been reporting basically the ecological challenges that incarcerated people have over the past, I'd say, decade or so. So I'm familiar with living through earthquakes and flooding and heat waves and fires, blackouts, and I just basically write about these experiences that I've been witness to, and so I'm super excited about being a part of this panel, and I look forward to questions about how I'm living right now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Juan. It's an honor to have you. Alleen, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm an independent investigative journalist, senior editor at the podcast and climate accountability publication Drilled, and I also have a newsletter called Eco Files. A lot of my reporting focuses on the intersection between criminalization and environmental crises. So that has often meant reporting on criminalization of environmental activists and land defenders, but it's also meant quite a few stories about the impact of the climate crisis on prisons. So in 2022, for The Intercept, I worked with senior research engineer Ethel Harris to map the locations of more than 6,500 prisons against flood risk, wildfire risk, and heat. We published that searchable map with a series of stories spotlighting climate-related experiences of people in prisons, and I've continued to publish stories on the issue since I shifted to working more as a freelance reporter. At this time of the year in particular, people who are incarcerated are really on my mind, because I know that as soon as the heat index starts to rise at all, people who are incarcerated are likely to be facing extremely uncomfortable and dangerous conditions. I'm interested in the subject because we know it's the most marginalized people who face the most severe climate risks. And anyone being squeezed right now will be even more endangered as the climate crisis deepens. So people who are incarcerated are some of the most marginalized and climate vulnerable people right now. And I think it's really important that journalists and researchers pay attention to this issue, because it will take an incredible amount of pressure for policymakers to move on protecting people who have been criminalized. This is only beginning to come onto people's radar. And if it's going to be addressed in a meaningful way, it will only happen because of a lot of hard work by a lot of the people in this room. So I'm glad to be here.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Thanks, Alleen. And Ufoma, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ufoma. I'm also really excited to be here. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm actually getting ready to defend next month, so I'm really excited for that. But for the last 4 years, for my dissertation, I've been conducting community-engaged research with the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons to understand and develop geospatial tools to support advocacy around environmental and climate injustice. FTP, or Fight Toxic Prisons, is a grassroots coalition of folks who are formerly incarcerated and or directly impacted by environmental and criminal injustice. And they organize at the intersection of incarceration, health, and ecology. And they've been doing this work for close to a decade now, at local and national levels in the South and parts of Appalachia. In terms of my personal and collaborative research on this topic, I've utilized both qualitative and quantitative research methods over the years. After first building a relationship with FTP, we collaborated on a grant from NASA with an aim to develop geospatial analyses and a geospatial tool to explore environmental hazards in prisons. I spent the first year of this collaboration doing 22 interviews with FTP, as well as other organizers who work on prison environmental justice across 8 different states in the United States, to understand how they currently use geospatial data in their organizing against toxic prisons, challenges with existing tools, and opportunities for new developments of geospatial data and tools. Following on this community engaged work, our team has developed and applied various geospatial data sets to quantify burdens of air pollution and extreme heat in prison landscapes. And this will be shared in some forthcoming publications. We have also collaborated on a tool that has been entirely developed in partnership with FTP, as well as focus groups with directly impacted people. And this tool will be freely and public available for exploring this data and this broader topic of climate injustice and incarceration. In terms of just like what brings me to this topic, I have loved ones who've been impacted by incarceration and have worked in environmental data or environmental science adjacent things for many years. And learning about this intersection has, just absolutely moved me and motivated me to work on this issue because as folks have already highlighted and we'll go into further, incarcerated people are amongst the most vulnerable of our population with limited agency to regulate their exposure. A lot of us are already seeing some of the impacts of climate change, from heat waves to flooding, but a big difference is we can step into our house, many of us can step into our house and turn on air conditioning or modify what we are wearing to better endure the climate around us. That is not the case for incarcerated people. And if this human dimension isn't enough, even though it should be, another angle to consider when trying to bring together this topic of mass incarceration and climate justice is that prisons themselves and other carceral facilities are also a massive source of environmental degradation, with many facilities across the US routinely fined by state, local, and federal governments for dumping pollution into the air and into waterways that are public or protected areas. So in addition to the environmental injustice and climate injustice, prisons are also a sustainability issue.
Thanks, Ufoma, and thanks everyone. I really am eager to this panel. I want to start with Amika and Juan. So what are some of the challenges incarcerated people and their families experience related to climate justice? And how do these reveal larger long-term problems with mass incarceration? Let's start with Juan.
Okay. Well, like in my experience, some of the major challenges come from just absolute overcrowding. And so, for instance, the housing unit where I live right now has 414 cells, and 2 people are assigned to each one of these cells. Now, the size of the cell is approximately 4 by 9. That's the size of your average parking space. And so 2 people are occupying this space. And while occupying this space in this building, I don't know the exact dimensions of the buildings, but they're super crowded. And the biggest challenge dealing with whether it's heat or cold is that the buildings are unventilated. The windows are actually welded shut. I have a photograph of North Block, the housing unit where I'm at right now, when it was built in the around the I'd say the 1940s or so, 1950s maybe. I'm not sure exactly when it was built, but the windows were open. There weren't bars on it. There was at least ventilation. And so living under these overcrowded conditions in a place that's completely unventilated, when the weather gets extreme, it gets more extreme inside of the buildings. Then, for instance, today, right now, I came out of my cell, I looked to the left, and there's a cell leaking. And so we have these old, leaky cells with 2 people living in them, and we have to deal with climate. And I literally have 2 fans going on in my cell right now because the temperature outside is, I'd say, in the high 70s. And these are challenges in everyday life that people have to exist in. And so since I've been at San Quentin since 2007, and one of the biggest challenges during
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
one of the biggest challenges during fire season is the smoke. There's smoke in the air, and so people have to make a decision on whether or not to stay inside of the building where you have some protection against the smoke, or go outside to the prison yard where you have to actually deal with the smoke. And so these are like current challenges, but I really want to emphasize the fact that the biggest challenge that incarcerated people have is that we're pretty much stuck where we're stuck. And when there's some sort of disaster that it occurs, whether it's an infectious disease, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, we don't have very many choices. And the choice that is made for us is put us inside of a cell, lock the door, and wait, and be quiet, and don't say anything. And so when that happens, we're cut off from our families. In the past, we were cut off from our families. Since we have the tablets, that eased at least some of the communication problems. But in the history that I've had with CDCR inside of prisons, it's staying in contact with family is probably one of the biggest challenges that folks have while incarcerated. And that's really just touching the surface of what the challenges are dealing with climate change in incarceration. But I just want to emphasize overcrowding is absolutely the biggest challenge.
Thanks, Juan. And Amika, what are some of the challenges incarcerated folks and their families experience, and what are these reveal about mass incarceration?
Thanks, Eric. I also, like Juan, need to talk about conditions, right? I actually was thinking about 2009 when I entered the California Institution for Women, which is a prison down south. At that time, we were at 176% capacity. And so what that looked like was we were housed in every nook and cranny of the prison. We had what were supposed to be day rooms where people could, socialize with each other or watch television or something like that. There were no day rooms. They were filled with 16 bunks at that time, which meant 32 women. And we had access to one toilet at that time. Also, the boiler rooms were full of bunks. I mean, we were really just kind of jammed everywhere. We also did not have safe drinkable water at that time, and we were given bottled water. So we, could just imagine kind of like what we were showering in, or when we did have access to showers. But the kind of overcrowding and conditions it's so extreme. And I know in the report that we're talking about today, we saw the Brown versus Plata decision that actually forced the reduction of the prison population due to this overcrowding. And in 2011 is when we started to see that shift. That was when the day rooms cleared back out, and we got, I think, I don't know what we're at capacity wise, we're still over 100% today. But conditions are just so extreme on the inside. So like Juan said, when infectious disease comes through, COVID, all of the things that we are kind of dealing with, we're navigating these really, really extreme conditions. The other thing that I want to bring up as someone that experienced being an incarcerated firefighter is also just the kind of complexities of being an incarcerated firefighter and dealing with the dynamic of prison labor, right? We, as a firefighter, my pay was 37 cents an hour. That equaled about $56 a month for a check. And we were doing really frontline intense work. At that time, California, the fire force was made up of almost 40% of incarcerated people who California relied on. That stat has changed a bit, but the dynamic hasn't really changed. We are still a really significant part of the labor force in California. And so I just think it's something else to bring up that's important when we're talking about conditions and mass incarceration, and also the heavy reliance of the state on incarcerated people to get these types of jobs done. Yeah.
Thanks, Amika. Yeah, the overcrowding is a significant issue. And I think what often goes unnoticed, but is still a huge issue, is related to power outages as well. When we talk about these large-scale climate hazards, frequently the power is out, and the power is out for many, many days. Alleen and Ufoma, I want to turn to you. Both of you have looked into climate justice and incarceration across the US. Starting with Alleen, can you tell us about how climate affects incarcerated people across the US and how it may be different or similar to what Amika and Juan described?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I can start by talking a little bit about the reporting I did for The Intercept. Again, we mapped detention facilities across the US against flood risk, wildfire risk, and heat. And, the big picture is that we found that things are very bad for people in prisons now who are experiencing climate-related impacts, and they're about to get a lot worse. So more than a third of the detention facilities in the US are in areas that have historically had more than 50 days a year with a heat index above 90 degrees. So that's enough to make people dealing with a range of health issues sick. That will go from a third of detention facilities to 3/4, according to data from the Union of Concerned Scientists. No carceral institution today is located in a county with more than 50 days a year at 105 degrees heat index. By 2100, almost 700 facilities will be at that level. That's mostly in Texas, Florida, and Louisiana. The most severe impacts that we're seeing from this kind of heat is death. A researcher named Julie Scarha worked closely with organizers with this group, Texas Prisons Community Advocates, and found that in facilities lacking air conditioning, more than 250 Texans died over the past 2 decades due to heat. Temperatures inside some of those facilities have been recorded as high as 149 degrees Fahrenheit. So, again, according to this data that I reviewed at The Intercept, by the end of the century, thousands of prisons across the US, from New Jersey to Minnesota, will experience the kind of heat that Texas sees today. So what that means is that historically only 224 facilities in 7 states were in places with more than 10 days over 105 degrees. By 2100, more than half of the prisons, jails, and detention centers in the US, over 3,500 facilities in 32 states will reach that
This
level.
call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
My reporting has also shown that mapping these risks doesn't tell the whole story. If you look at the way people are impacted, it varies tremendously beyond geographical location, because it also depends on local policies, the attitude of individual wardens, staffing problems at different sites, the condition of each specific facility. And the places being impacted are not just the South and the West Coast, where we really think about extreme climate impacts. Another study by this researcher, Julie Scarha, showed that a 2-day heat wave meant a mortality increase of 21% in the Northeast compared to 1.3% mortality increase across the South, because facilities in the Northeast are overall not prepared for heat. When we think of wildfires in prisons, we often think of a wave of flames approaching prison walls, which is terrifying and, of course, has happened. However, as Juan noted, and I think others have noted as well, the smoke and the impact on the power grid is often what I've heard people actually talk about experiencing. And
You
again,
have 60 seconds remaining.
Again, that's not just on the West Coast. I did a piece for The Appeal last summer that found that more than 150 detention facilities in the Northeast experienced hazardous air as wildfire smoke from Canada reached the region last spring. With flooding, it doesn't matter if you're in a place with low flood risk, if the roof leaks, or if there are hurricane strength winds that batter the building. Many jails and prisons were built as the war on drugs ramped up and have since been pretty much neglected. So worsening disasters are going to test these deteriorating buildings. They're falling apart just as the climate crisis is deepening. And I also want to mention that in Louisiana, where there's a lot of hurricanes, a lot of local jails started offering up their facilities for ICE to detain asylum seekers. In recent years, I spoke to one asylum seeker, Angel Argueta Anariba, who left Honduras because of Hurricane Mitch in 1998, and then found himself repeatedly facing really poor conditions during hurricanes, at times with ventilation, toilets, and lights shutting down as water crept in. So he was a climate migrant, and he found those climate impacts kind of compounded in a system where migration is criminalized. Climate migration is criminalized as well. I don't want to take up too much time, but the last thing I'll say is that, with wildfires and hurricanes, evacuation is not an easy answer. Prison evacuations frequently go poorly. When Oregon evacuated prisons being approached by wildfires in 2020, for example, incarcerated people reported being left without sufficient food, water, bathrooms, and at that time, COVID-19 protections. Some were unable to access medications they needed. Others reported being placed in facilities alongside and facing retaliation from members of their former gangs. So there's really not an easy solution. These facilities are not set up for the climate crisis.
Thanks, Alleen. And Ufoma, same question for you.
Yeah, I want to just build on that by sharing some statistics from research I've been doing. So the first part of my research has looked at patterns of air temperature for the last 33 years. So from 1990 to 2023. And I look at both patterns of extreme temperatures in the summer, as well as long-term trends that reveal kind of like how climate change is making heat get hotter and hotter in certain areas. So just to share some of those stats, and this is going to be in a forthcoming publication, but we found looking at just prisons, so that's about 1,600 facilities in the United States, that 67% of facilities in 44 states and the District of Columbia had at least one day each summer that was above 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And I highlight that number because currently, and I don't know if anyone has actually said this yet, but a lot of carceral facilities do not have air conditioning, or they might have partial air conditioning just where the warden is or in the visitation areas, et cetera. And in facilities, in the fraction of facilities that do have air conditioning, they're commonly regulated to keep the internal temperatures below 85. So I explored this 85 threshold as it's a plausible standard that could be applied in policies across the United States. So 67% of facilities are currently experiencing at least one day.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Over 85 degrees Fahrenheit in recent years. Another aspect I mentioned was looking at long-term trends. So we looked at temperature anomalies, which is basically a measure of how different is an extreme temperature for a particular region and particular prison compared to a long-term historical average. And we found the highest anomalies in the Pacific Northwest, in the Northeast, as well as parts of Texas in the Midwest. So kind of piggyback on what Alleen was sharing about how some of the highest mortality rates are being experienced in the Northeast, in the Pacific Northwest, because the extreme heat that people are experiencing is so unlike the historical norm for these places, and the facilities just were not built to really withstand that. Then moving on, another part of my research has looked at particulate matter 2.5, which is fine particulate matter air pollution. It's one of the most harmful forms of air pollution. And so I looked at historical records of PM 2.5 using a satellite derived data set from 1998 to 2022. And this is again looking at specifically prisons. And I found that for that entire time period, on average, prisons had a higher PM 2.5 exposure than the general US population. Some prisons actually experienced annual PM 2.5 concentrations that were more than twice the US average. To put this in context, the federal government currently regulates PM 2.5 at 9 micrograms per cubic meter. In the public health arena, this is still way too high of a standard, meaning that people can experience negative health impacts at measures much below 9. So, but the current standard is 9. And the maximum annual PM 2.5 burden that I found at a prison for the year 2022 was 18.5 micrograms per cubic meter. So just to show kind of the disparity that some incarcerated populations are living in. And just to wrap up, I want to just highlight the geospatial tool that we're working to develop, where you'll be able to explore a lot of this data that I'm mentioning, as well as other data created from other sources in this forthcoming tool. So I'm just going to play this video and narrate a little bit, but this is a prototype right now. This is not publicly available, but we've been working with the Fight Toxic Prisons to design this interactive geospatial tool for exploring both climate hazards as well as other environmental hazards. And so what you're seeing is a map that shows density of carceral facilities by area. As you zoom in, it will update the list of facilities that are in that map extent. And it will also have a dynamic legend to the left that shows you what you're looking at. So this example right here is showing a forecast of temperature. So you could plausibly use this to look up a specific facility that you have a loved one at and see how hot is it going to be in the next couple of days. And do you want to send maybe some resources to your loved one to try and help them manage that heat. And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. There's going to be different environmental hazard layers. And then we're also working on this tab for a slightly more in-depth exploration of some of these hazards. So you can query by state, jurisdiction, security level to filter down to facilities that meet that query. And then as you narrow down to a specific facility, for example, I clicked on Calipatria State Prison here in California, and you can see some just high-level statistics of demographics at this area, the particulate matter 2.5, which I'll note here again, this is above the federal standard. And then we also incorporated the data from the Intercept climate and punishment map on flood risk, heat risk, and wildfire risk. The last part that we're doing in this tool is also incorporating storytelling. So each of these prisons represent areas where we have firsthand narratives from people who've been incarcerated at that facility talking about the experience of environmental hazards. I know I've gone on for quite a bit, so I'll pause here, but at the end of this call, we're going to share a form, and you can fill out your information to be notified of when this is released. Thanks.
Thanks, Ufoma. We are going to kind of skip ahead a little bit. We're having a really great conversation, and I want to make sure we get to this really important question. And if we have a little bit more time, I will ask some of the other questions. But we've heard a lot about the vulnerabilities. We've heard a lot about prisons in geographically isolated areas and in sited on toxic sites. We've also heard that there's a lack of infrastructure in some of the carceral facilities or most of the carceral facilities across the US. But what should we do about climate change and incarceration? I think often the first response is to make some pretty significant investments in infrastructure. So I want to ask you all individually, we'll start with Amika. Do you support the solution? If not, what other alternatives should we explore?
Thanks, Eric. I I can't say that that we support the idea of further investment into these facilities that already have this kind of massive amount of funding. And we are where we are condition wise. I definitely think that releases, reducing the prison population is
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
one of the most important things that we can focus on policy wise, because the conditions, I think we just can't keep focusing on infrastructure and conditions within the prisons. I think we need to focus on alternatives to incarceration. And yeah.
Thanks. Let's move on to Juan. What a recommendation? Do you support the investment?
Oh man, see, that's a really tough question. You know, being in prison, you know, my prison experience lasts well over 30 years. I've spent more than half my life inside of prisons, and so, you know, I'm with folks every day, and I see the suffering that people are going through. The one thing that and with the $80 billion a year that we spend on prisons, $16 billion in California model that's investing about $280 million in San Quentin. You know, that's just the way it is. That's, you know, and I'm not saying that I accept that, but the one thing that I support is ending suffering now. And so what would end my suffering right now? Open the damn windows in North Block. Give me some ventilation. Give me some air conditioning, because I got to live here tomorrow. Give me good food. Give me good health care. And so we're spending all this money on these prisons, and we're spending all this money on like things that aren't working. And that's the reality. But if I go, I want to start ending suffering, human suffering, then what would people who are incarcerated ask for? They will ask for cold water. They'd ask for a comfortable place to live. And so that's like the reality, when the answer to this question is not to support an institution that is poisonous to our communities. And that's what prisons are. And so we're fixed into this situation on, if I ask someone who's free, do you want to spend your money on poisoning your own communities by putting them into prisons? They're going to say no. But if I ask somebody who's incarcerated, would you like to have a decent meal? Would you like to go to live comfortably right now? They're going to say yes. And so can both of these things exist at the same time is my question. Of course they can. Of course we can start deconstructing some of these institutions that don't work and making the conditions in which people live within these institutions more humane. And so it's an expenditure. At the end of the day, it's going to be an expenditure, but I would ask people to look at the long-term shift in resources outside of mass incarceration to community support, to early childhood development, to really making our public schools a place of learning, to giving adequate health care, to giving people decent jobs. And these are the fundamentals that we need to start talking about, because the way I see prisons is prisons today are the result of failed policies that we should already had addressed years and years ago. We can't look at prisons as the answers to anything. It's not a crime reduction strategy. It's not a public safety strategy. It's an absolute waste. So, meanwhile, I know that in practicality, I'm not getting out of prison tomorrow, but I sure would like a cold glass of water.
Thanks, Juan. Alleen, the same question?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I really defer to people who are incarcerated and their families to answer that question. I've heard some people saying they don't want to see any investment, others saying we need air conditioning because decarceration isn't going to happen fast. I will say, I think multiple judges have weighed in that this, especially with the heat right now, this kind of treatment of people in prisons is unconstitutional, represents cruel and unusual punishment. And we're approaching a crossroads where you're going to see more wrongful death lawsuits. And these, I guess, state governments and federal governments are either going to have to invest a lot of money in the system of mass incarceration or let a lot of people out. I do think that environmental disaster is inherent to prison systems. These are not institutions that are compatible with the climate crisis. It's difficult to safely evacuate them. They concentrate people with health conditions that are involved or that are vulnerable to climate impacts in one place. They concentrate people who are devalued in one place. Infrastructure almost inevitably ends up neglected. And I really just don't have a lot of optimism that these facilities can be truly climate proofed. I do want to say that I've done some reporting that's focused on the work of Texas prisons community advocates in Texas, of course. And one of the things that they've been working on is getting air conditioning in Texas prisons. And I think that whatever solution you're looking at, it's useful to look at the organizing that they've done. And I think everyone on this panel has done similar organizing. So I'll just kind of bring them into the conversation because I think it's instructive. So, the way they've pursued this goal of air conditioning is that, they're led primarily by formerly incarcerated people and loved ones of people who are incarcerated, with a lot of input from people who are in prisons. A big chunk of their work is helping people respond to the crises that loved ones are facing in prisons. So they are very much in touch with people who are incarcerated. They've partnered extensively with researchers, people like UFOMA, who have put out some really strong academic work on heat in prisons. A researcher I haven't mentioned, Carly Purdom, for example, worked with the group to do this super detailed survey, learning how people are experiencing the heat. And all this research ended up forming the building blocks for this lawsuit that was recently filed, arguing that the unaddressed heat represents cruel and unusual punishment. And it's also been used to advance legislation for air conditioning, which in, I think, 2023 passed in the House, but died in the Senate. So they've been able to build power through this really collaborative work. And, I think whatever solution people want to pursue, that is a useful strategy.
UFOMA?
Yeah, so I definitely echo the sentiment that we have to center the perspectives of currently and directly impacted people first and foremost. And so to that end, I mostly just want to share things that other people have told me. Multiple people who are either, formerly incarcerated or have a loved one who's currently incarcerated have reminded me that the environmental harm that we're talking about today is only a fraction of the severe abuse and harm experienced by people who are incarcerated. And so while investing in reforms and infrastructural improvements like air conditioning can help with some of that harm, the other harm of the prison industrial complex is still going to persist if we continue to just let it exist in its current form. And that any sort of reform, even something like air conditioning, can still be weaponized as punishment or part of a kind of cycle of torture. One person who was incarcerated in Texas talked about how in efforts to kind of address this extreme heat issue in Texas, a lot of the Texas state prisons have designated respite areas. So these are air-conditioned rooms where you can, in theory, ask the guards to escort you to those rooms, and you can sit in the air conditioning rooms for as long as you want, in theory. But this person talked about how they would every day witness guards just ignore the request to go to the respite areas, they would be laughed at and just, neglected. And so just investing in these types of resources does not address the fact that the systems, a lot of the people that work there and run these institutions are really just built on a primary goal of punishment and not comfort. And not that the investments are not going to reach everybody because of that fact.
Thanks, everyone. We would now like to take some time to answer some questions from the audience. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please keep it concise, as we'd like to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. I'm going to start out with Alleen. You briefly touched about this on this, so I'll direct this question to you. Paraphrasing here, but do you think that the effects of climate change have been negated or disregarded by the DOJ and likely other oversight agencies, insofar that human and civil rights are deprived without consideration for the exposure to environmental risks?
I guess a couple things that I don't know if I'll do my best to answer this question. One thing I would say is that the federal government isn't currently playing any major role in setting standards for carceral facilities across the US where it comes to temperature. I believe they have some guidelines for federal prisons, but there's no federal law that says prisons have to be under 85 degrees besides, the US Constitution. I'm not aware of any DOJ investigations into, cruel and unusual punishment at overheated, unair conditioned facilities. So I do think that the federal government could be playing a larger role. Absolutely. And I think this is a constitutional issue, and they should consider that.
Thanks. I'm going to direct this next question to Amika. Do you think that there's a way to build alliances on this topic, especially because there's overlapping issues for other populations of vulnerable folks, like people who are older, people with disabilities, and youth? Or is it more strategic to keep it focused on the carceral spaces?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I actually think it's a crucial one, and we believe that coalition building in this moment, that we have to think about things intersectionally. And so, at Sister Warriors, we welcome all allies to join in the struggle. Like Ufoma mentioned earlier, this is an extreme issue for people. We are dealing with the dynamic of working on conditions for people that are here now, that are there now, and also trying to build new systems so that the prisons are not the only system that we rely on. But there are so many other issues that are impacting incarcerated people, right? And we need a kind of wide range of support and coalition.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
So I think it's actually strategic that we continue to build broader and not narrow in on this, because we can't separate the issues here. So, yeah.
I'm going to direct this next question to Ufoma. One of the solutions that a lot of us, including myself, have lifted up has been decarceration to reduce the risk of climate hazards. There's been kind of an effort or rethinking to increase kind of this digital surveillance or electronic monitoring of folks. Do you think that increasing people who are considered high risk but low, essentially, if we release a lot of people, should we be releasing them with electronic monitoring conditions, and what effect would that have on folks who are being released into community?
I'm going to be completely honest. I don't know if I'm qualified to actually answer that question. I know there are people doing really in-depth research on the topic of surveillance, and how pervasive it can be, and the ways that even these types of surveillance that are meant to be non-invasive or less invasive can still cause a lot of harm, and prevent people from, pursuing livelihood with the agency that they deserve. So I guess my answer would say that I lean that it's probably still not a solution. Surveillance can be weaponized. It is routinely weaponized for purposes beyond what their public stated purpose is of the surveillance. And so I personally would not trust just transforming the current system of incarceration with the same people, with the same power structure, with the same hierarchies, into just a now technological form of incarceration and surveillance. It's likely to produce new inequities and new unintended consequences, or in some cases, intended consequences of harm for people. Yeah.
Juan, because you're currently based in California, what California prisons do you think should be prioritized for closure? Specifically, there's a lot of evidence to show that most of them are impacted by fire, some of them are impacted by flooding, but are there specific recommendations on which to close?
Yeah. So see, that's again, like, these are questions that are kind of complicated. If I were to address that surveillance question, I would probably be able to better answer that, because all that surveillance stuff, that's just a money grab. You see, that's just additional expenditures or a program that is absolutely not needed. And so I wouldn't be looking at prison closures. I would be looking at the people who are incarcerated unnecessarily. You see, and so I don't care how many prisons are open. I really don't. What I care about are the people who are occupying these spaces unnecessarily, that in California costing the taxpayers $132,000 apiece. In California, with approximately 40,000 lifers, half of the population, you have an aging population that, if you just look at the science, you look at these people who are in their 60s and 70s, who have been incarcerated for decades. I know multiple people who, multiple forensic psychologists have looked at these people, and they say that their risk assessments are low. And so, I don't want to talk about prison closures, because that's a loaded question. That's a political question, to where people that listen to these conversations and goes, "Oh, they're closing prisons, they're letting people go." That's not the conversation that we should be having about these institutions. Conversations we should be having about these institutions are about how many people we're sending to prison, and then the prisons are not the problem, because prisons are a receiving institution. We have a system that currently sends people with addiction problems and mental health issues inside of institutions that make them worse. This is crazy. And then once you're inside of this system, you have these people who are paid exorbitant amounts of money to surveil the population. So we're backwards. So the question is not closing down prisons. The question that we should be answering is, how do we safely return people to their families? How do we set up a system that does not do more harm to our communities than good? And so, I can't focus on any one institution or any one of the 35 prisons in California. I wouldn't do that. I'd focus on the people who are in there that don't need to be in there anymore. Just let them go home. They're just going to go home and and go fishing with their grandkids, most of them. Just to chill out. You know, a lot of people have aged out of criminality. They're no longer dangerous. And that's proven by studies done by Stanford on the relief of the lifer population in California prisons, who have a recidivism rate of less than 1% for any new crime. So, you know, that's my take on that, on the surveillance, which is just a money grab. It's just a job that somebody wants to have. You're going to be monitoring, put an ankle monitor on a 70-year-old man who's just visiting his grandkid.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And pay attention to the ever increasing aging population in U.S. prisons and jails. So what's going on here?
Thanks, Juan. It's my pleasure now to reintroduce Kaya Stern back to the virtual floor and deliver some brief closing remarks.
Thank you. This concludes our program today. Thank you most sincerely to you, Eric, for moderating our discussion, and to our panelists for your inspiring work in the world, and to our audience for your thoughtful questions. I would like to especially thank people who are currently incarcerated, their families, advocates, and academics who are shining light on climate justice. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information about upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs and to see videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and take care.